agenda with information to start with on the Maple grant testimony. So this is the program that you remember we all took testimony on last year, the Meet Maple and Produce. And we're going to hear about the Maple part of it. Welcome.
Thank you.
And welcome, Christina. And we have Madison online. Hi, Madison. And you can hear us okay, and we'll be able to hear you.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yeah. Good. Okay. And I said to Abby that we've got only 45 minutes on the agenda, but we actually have more time than that. So I don't know how much information you have to present, but if we run long and if we have questions and it goes over, that's fine.
Great.
So do you want to get started?
Sure. Happy to. So Abby Willard, Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I'm going to start by just offering just a little context around the Maple Ag Development Grants. Christina is going to dig a little bit more into the details about the request for applications. And then Madison, who's the program manager for the Maple Grants, will talk about the data, if that sounds like a good matchup of information for you all. So I guess just wanting to start with appreciation for this committee's support and the General Assembly's support for the $2.3 million last year, one-time appropriation of $2.3 million that was to support Meet Maple and Produce infrastructure investment grants. The idea started in the Future of Ag Commission report that went to the governor's office as a valuable recommendation to support diversified agriculture. Our agency saw these infrastructure investments as a really important way of continuing to protect our agricultural landscape, our working landscape, as a nice augmentation to our dairy industry across the state. And it's been great to look at this as an opportunity of assistance for growers to design and hopefully be funded for projects that help them both do growth and development within their industry and their business and respond to shifts that are happening within climate, within the markets, and with consumer preferences. So I think you all know this, and it sounds like you'll hear from the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association later this week, and they'll have all the best stats. But the maple sector is a very important part of economic development within agriculture in the state. So $56 million industry in Vermont. We're the largest maple producer in the country, and Vermont maple industry provides greater than half the nation's total crop. So that's a really prominent and prestigious place for Vermont's maple industry to sit and an important place to maintain. So I think that's where a lot of these innovative development and advancement technologies are really important for the maple sector to kind of maintain that role and that position. And yet the industry is really subject to climate, just like all other forms of agriculture. So last year was a really great season. So the industry made over 2.5 million gallons of syrup with over 2.6 million taps. In 2022, last year's season was kind of all over the map. There were some operations that did really well, great fluctuations throughout the state, depending upon the microclimate of their sugar bush and their operation throughout the state. And then this year, there's already been syrup made for the season. So we just never can count upon the year-over-year consistency within the maple industry. And that's something that this sector has had to contend with for generations. But to the $2.3 million that was appropriated in fiscal year 24 that was focused on Meet Maple and Produce, our agency made a decision to pull out the maple and run a separate request for applications just for maple, and then coupled produce and meat in a second request for applications. So the maple application request was open from October 10th until November 21st, closed right before Thanksgiving. That request period was for $540,000 approximately, which was the 25% cap that was placed on the maple grants out of the $2.3 million. Based on industry feedback and stakeholder conversations, the decision was also made for grants to be limited between, what's it, $15,000 and $100,000 for the maple sector. For produce and meat, those just were announced that the request for applications will open on January 19th and be open through February 26th, so almost to the end of February. In the produce and meat sector, there's 1.6 million approximately available for awards. And those grants can range between $35,000 and $300,000. So different minimum and maximum amounts for both grant programs, and many similarities, and that neither of them include match. And we're sort of experimenting with some interesting parts of this program, which Christina can talk a little bit more about. So what you've heard, and we've kind of given you some introductory kind of news about, is the overwhelming response that we had to the Maple request for applications. So during that period, we received 351 applications. Upon review, 331 of them were complete and eligible, and they requested just under $18 million in funds. What we also found interesting, and Madison, I think, has access to the data that we have and can, answer questions that you may specifically have, but a significant majority, so I think over 90% that we just looked at today, are applicants that have not applied for or received a grant from the Agency of Agriculture previous in the last 5 years. So either they are new to applying to funding at the agency altogether, or they have not received a grant from us or applied for funding from us in recent years. So that's an impressive population that we're reaching, a whole new demographic through this very targeted outreach and through the very maple-centric promotion that happened through these ag development grants focused on maple. This is also the single largest response to one funding opportunity that our division has ever seen, and possibly our agency has ever seen. The closest ever prior was out of the Dairy Business Innovation Center, and it was only half as much of a demand and a response. So this is it is totally unprecedented to see this kind of demand. And it represents, if we think there's about 3,000 maple sugar makers in the state of Vermont, we received a response from about 10% of the industry, which was also pretty significant to be able to have that amount of response concentrated in one granting program. So, yeah.
Can you just remind me what the criteria was around, like this? There's so many grants. Like, I'm just trying to remember exactly who was eligible and what for exactly.
Sure. So I think that's the piece that Christina can kind of speak to. And I might just add one thing, Representative Pearl, and then happy to transition to Christina if now's the right time. There's a few different ways that we can look at this kind of interest and demand. One could be of being overwhelmed by how do we figure out how to review 331 applications by 3 different reviewers? How do we find the 63 different individuals that have some maple connection or ag expertise to be able to review applications? Or we can really see this as a really exciting, opportunity to have access to this much data about businesses that want to see growth and development within their sector, are really looking at opportunities to respond to around climate resiliency. They're thinking about production efficiency and paying special attention to product quality and food safety. So I think we're aiming on the latter, sort of feeling a bit overwhelmed by the demand and the fact that we'll have to turn away so many of the applications, but really excited to see the enthusiasm within the maple community, and spend some time with this data to really understand what do we know about what this sector's priorities are, what their interests are, where they have really identified opportunity for growth. So I think it might be a good space, Christina, if you want to just talk about the RFA and the question that Representative Pearl specifically was asking around eligibility. Great. Any general questions, just like how we got to here?
Yeah, Representative Rice and
just two, and you can decide when is the best time to answer these questions, but just I'd love to hear about some of that outreach that you did that
Yeah.
set this apart.
Yeah.
And then also just interested in if you have feedback yet from the applicants that points toward it being a major contributing reason that there were so many applicants that there isn't a match requirement, if that is a big part of the.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both Christina and maybe even at Madison can speak to the outreach as they did sort of the stakeholder engagement and gathered industry feedback as well as helped set what the priorities were for this funding opportunity. As to how much of an impact having no match had on the volume of applications we received, I don't know that we have an answer to that yet.
And Madison may have some anecdotal input on that.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think this is part of the experiment is like, does no match make a huge difference? Did the timing and a separation of a single sector application as opposed to something that's captured in a full agricultural development opportunity make a real difference? Was the timeline really conducive to this industry of being available in the fall, not in the winter? So yeah, I think there's a real opportunity. And we now have a great data set of people to kind of connect with, I think, to maybe get better answers going forward.
And Lipsky.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Durfee. Abby, this is, I'm sort of backing up maybe in the last session.
Yep.
You know, our committee has 3 general responsibilities of agriculture, food resiliency, and forestry. So it's sort of, this has probably been answered, but there's a lot of overlap in those responsibilities. And the question is a clarification. Is the maple industry an agricultural product and not a forest product? Which is what I was sensing from it. So the economic impact of that is really an agricultural.
Because it's producing food, yeah.
And
It's tricky.
understood, and thank you for that clarification. And there are many dairy operations or other active farm operations that have current use woodlots that are dedicated to maple production. So my question is, what percentage do you reckon of these applicants were from farm operations versus pure, maple enterprises around Franklin County, Essex County, or anywhere in the state?
That's another great question. I think we'll see if Madison has any of that data from what she's been able to pull. We do know that there's a wide range of applicants from across the state, so across all counties, all size operations. So there's small operations that are, small and growing to like large, kind of more of the industrial size, and a full range of size of the grant request. So in that $15,000 range, all the way up to the $100,000. So I think we have a pretty interesting cross-section of the industry captured in this 331 eligible applicants. But I don't know that we asked a question in the application to be able to determine whether they are sugaring operation as part of a larger agricultural venture. But I think it's actually a good question that this may set us up for some follow-up surveying that would be really great to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, maybe my last point would just be kind of the growth that we've seen in the maple industry in the last decade plus has been a real growth and maturation of the maple industry, where they're making these huge contributions to the ag economic kind of impact in the state. It's not, just the pancake maple syrup product any longer. We've seen so many value-added products and lots of diversification happen within the sector, and we see that in many of these applications as well. And then lastly, just a real draw to Vermont from a tourism standpoint of visiting, sugaring operations, whether that's during the springtime, during maple open house weekends, or, through the Maple 100 promotion, which is all around visiting or participating in Maple activities in the fall. So anyway, I think we're really just seeing this sector kind of really blossom in new and different ways. That's been exciting. And this grant opportunity was an opportunity to kind of celebrate that and hopefully make investment in that.
Representative O'Brien.
Just, another way of asking Jim's question, it'd be interesting to know, say the 350 or 331, how many of those already consider themselves farms or farmers? Or how many would qualify given your reps? Because it doesn't take much, right, from income produced in the sugar rate. It wouldn't take much to come up with $2,000.
My sense is that these are not teeny tiny hobby operations that are, have 50 taps by bucket in their backyard. These are maple sugaring operations. So these are considered, viable businesses and would meet that $2,000 sales threshold. I can't guarantee you without looking at the full set, what percentage, but of all the applications that we've discussed and each individually reviewed, these are legitimate businesses that are looking to do some sort of expansion or diversification or energy efficiency improvements, production efficiency, labor reduction. They're businesses that are wanting to continue to produce a better, larger crop of maple product, whether that's on the sap side or finished product into syrup.
It'd be just interesting if sugar makers who are almost just devoted to sugar making really think of themselves as farmers, because by your standards,
Yeah,
they certainly qualify.
yeah, right. That's a good question.
All right, Christina, do you want to take it from there?
Thank you. Christina Sweet, Vermont Agency of Agriculture. Thanks so much for having me today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our outreach process, both to get feedback from stakeholders on the development of our request for applications or RFA, and then also on sharing that RFA and soliciting applications from maple producers and processors. So we knew we had a lot of room to develop parameters for this program, and we wanted to make the program available to all maple producers and processors in the state according to the language we had to work with from the law that was passed last year. And we also knew that because of that, we were really excluding any sort of research-only projects, and knew that there are other programs within our agency and within the state that could help, UVM Extension or other service providers do that kind of research. So we did work with UVM, both Proctor Maple Research Center and UVM Extension, as well as the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, to really understand where we wanted to prioritize funds through this program and develop 3 funding priorities for our request for applications. And the funding priorities are not really meant to exclude applications or exclude eligible projects in any way, but to really help make sure that we're addressing the most pressing needs in the maple industry, help to differentiate somewhat from the Working Lands Business Enhancement Grant Program, so maple producers could decide which program to apply to this year, since they did have the opportunity to apply to both or to choose one. And finally, to really help applicants sort of focus their applications, so they could choose a funding priority or more than one funding priority and use that priority as sort of a framework for their project and ways to tell the story of the impact that the project will have on their business or on the industry. So the project priorities the program priorities that we identified were climate resiliency, operational efficiency, and finally, food safety and food quality. And what was interesting, and this again, sort of gets into the application data we received, is that most applicants chose more than one, and many chose to describe how their project would impact their operations through all 3 of those lenses, which I thought was really interesting, that they were really thinking about climate resiliency. A lot of people were saying, hey, this is also going to help me operationally, and this is definitely going to have an impact on my efficiency and my food safety or food quality. People talked really specifically about, for example, how an upgrading equipment might help them with producing more light colored syrup or or syrup that they felt that they could get a higher price for down the road. But to get back to the stakeholder piece,
Was.
Oh, sorry. No problem. Just wanted to make sure I was covering anything. I did want to talk a little bit about the Working Lands Business Enhancement Grants, which were also available to Maple applicants this year, as it's, it's open to Maple applicants every year. That grant this year offered awards of $15,000 to $50,000. And they had a total of $530,000 to award, and that's to all sectors across the working landscape, including agriculture and forestry. So I believe there were 3 applicants who applied to both the Maple opportunity and the Working Lands Business Enhancement Grant opportunity. What we shared with producers and processors ahead of applying was that they could apply to both, but they would only be able to accept one grant in FY24. So in some ways, we were surprised that we didn't have very many who applied to both opportunities. I think it speaks to just how the overwhelming response to having a Maple-specific opportunity for the first time.
And match is different between.
And match is certainly different. So after we developed our RFA, we used many of our digital channels and stakeholder connections across the state to share this opportunity with producers and processors. But we also developed a postcard with Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association that we printed and shared with all of their members. So folks also got something in the mail letting them know that they could apply. And I will just say before we get more into the data, the magnitude of this response from the day the request for applications was live truly was overwhelming. As Abby said, we received almost double the number of applications for this opportunity that we've ever received in our highest demand opportunities in the past. But just the amount of work that Madison did as the program manager, receiving dozens of emails every day. Her voicemail box filled up multiple times. And she was really able to have a lot of conversations with folks in the industry and really connect with folks in the industry in a way that we haven't necessarily previously connected with the maple industry. And I think that while it will be really, really challenging to tell a couple hundred people that we can't give them grants, overall, I really think that we've started a relationship that is going to serve us in the industry over time. And so many folks that Madison spoke to were just really felt seen and recognized by the state as an important industry that deserved investment. And we're just really appreciative that this opportunity was there. I think that was primarily what I wanted to share about the RFA. I think the only other thing I'll share is that in addition to those 3 program priorities, we asked all applicants to talk about some objectives within their project to show what the impact would be on their project. So that could be quantitative, like they were going to increase production from X amount to Y amount, or it could be something they described in a narrative format. So we, saw everything from projected increases in production or in sales, or projected increases in operational efficiency to, folks talking about how they would really like to be able to tuck their kids in at night or go to a baseball game because they did it, or I guess it's maybe not baseball, but another type of basketball game, another type of sports game. Because they would have a remote monitoring system for their tap lines. They wouldn't be out checking their lines at dusk. So I think I will leave it there and open it up for questions, and Madison will be available to talk about the data as well.
Under the food safety and quality category, what are we seeing as far as what people are putting forward in that effort?
Yeah, I would say that there were sort of 3 areas. On the food safety side, there was elimination of any equipment that could cause lead contamination, which is a major concern from the state's perspective. And secondly, there was reduction of any chance of microbiological contamination. So folks being able to clean and sanitize equipment that previously had been really difficult to clean and sanitize. And on the quality side, we saw more being able to reach the right bricks so that they could, reduce spoilage down the line, or get more of that sort of higher grade or lighter colored syrup for a longer period of the season.
ERIX.
Yes.
Okay.
I am not the expert in all of those things, but it has to do with the sugar percentage
In the density.
in the density, yeah.
The lead abatement or eliminating lead from the system somehow. So we're not talking about pails, but where else would lead be part of the?
Abby may be able to speak to this
Yeah,
more
I
than I
mean,
can.
so the maple industry made a really wholesale change over decades ago. And yet there are some operations that have not been caught up with kind of the modernization of new equipment. We've also learned that in lead solder or in copper fittings or like sometimes internal working parts of pieces of sugaring equipment, there's actually lead contamination sources. So even with modern improvements, there can still be some of these lead contributing sources. And so some of the applicants were just saying they hadn't replaced their front pan, or they'd done their front pan but not their preheater hood, or, you know, like they kind of had a vision for this improvement upgrade that they wanted to do and just sort of lacked the capital to do it. And this saw this granting opportunity as that time.
Weigh in on that, I mean, such things as stainless steel storage drums, stainless steel storage, sap storage.
Right.
Our original filter press had a bronze pump. Switched that out to, well, we switched out to an air pump, diaphragm pump, but those kind of things you wouldn't even think about.
Right.
Or the lead pans, lead solder was the thing way back.
Right.
I'm not trying to open a rabbit hole or go down it, but, you know, we in America are facing new awarenesses of PFAS and PFOS, and we've all observed in the maple industry with the pipeline system has a lot of, some blue, some black, some clear. Is there any awareness in the food safety category that, is there some testing of this? I read something over the weekend, maybe down at Mount Scottney or the town of Scottney water system that got an EPA letter. You know, apparently these chemicals are everywhere in our soils. Don't know quite how they got there. But my question is that an area that we're looking at?
Yeah, so
I'm not being.
I don't know. I mean, I have to be really honest. I don't know what the potential risk is for PFAS within the maple industry. It'll be interesting to see if there are any applications that touch on this subject. I mean, one piece I'll offer is that, you know, the sugar woods that are typically being tapped have probably never been used for, I don't know if I should say never, are probably less likely to have been engaged in some other kind of industrial land use in the last 150 years, right? Because they have mature trees that are, you know, at least 10 centimeters in diameter, you know, like, but so whether we have no forever chemicals in the soils that are growing maple trees, I certainly couldn't make that claim. But I think it's a slightly different land use than we might see in some other of our agricultural lands.
Just to clarify, I think
No.
it's the equipment that's.
And I don't know about the tubing, yeah, right, so, okay, sorry. Yes, and that's the piece I don't know. I don't know if there's PFOA concerns with the tubing that's kind of an industry standard. I would assume someone has been doing that testing and thinking about it, but it's a great question that we'll have to look into. I don't know.
With some of the other folks who are coming in later.
Yeah, I would say this is where like the maple industry expertise does not necessarily reside within us, but, you know, from the Maple Sugar Makers Association or some of the manufacturers would be a great place to ask that question.
My recollection, and probably gonna be a little fuzzy on the outcome, but when the PFAS problem emerged in Bennington, North Bennington, 6 years or so ago now, whenever that was, some folks from the college down there did lots of testing, but including on maple and sap. And I think it came back, without a concern. But as I say, I'm not entirely sure of that. We'll go back and check. But somebody was asking that question anyway when it was a big issue. Hopefully. John.
How does what's an example of a climate resilience priority application? I mean, like maple trees seem really stressed given our extreme weather lately. I just wondered if does it tie into that?
I think Madison this is maybe where we can pull her in, but I would say that there were both applications that focused on climate resiliency in terms of the actual forest and the sugar bush, but also in the fuel that they're using to process.
Yeah.
So reductions in wood or moving to an electrical system or a solar system in
Or
some
solar
cases
powered, yeah.
to reduce the amount of fuel or at least move away from fossil fuels to actually do that processing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the production efficiency, so if they had, a more efficient burning fuel, they were, having a climate impact that way as well. But yeah, this could be a great time. I know that Madison has reviewed far more of these applications than anyone. And may have some great examples to share with the committee.
Okay, good.
When you're ready.
Madison, let's hear from you.
Yeah, hi guys. So just on a quick note there, one thing that I think came up a lot with climate resilience was reverse osmosis machines to try and increase the efficiency of, if you're burning wood to do your sugaring, if you have to burn less of it, that's better for the climate. And so that was sort of one of the more, I would say, low-hanging fruits of the climate resilience side, but it did include that as well. So I figured I could just kind of hit some high-level data with the applications that we received, and then I also have access to other data. It's kind of all over the place, so there may be points where we have to dig in a little bit more before we can get your answers, but I'd love to hear what you guys are interested in hearing about. So just in terms of demographics, in those 331 eligible applications, all 14 counties in Vermont were represented, and pretty much all of them are represented in the top 50 scores as well. Obviously, we haven't filtered through the scores extensively yet. We just finished that up last week. So that's sort of a surface level look at it, but it is really interesting. Around 58 of our applications said that they collect sap to sell. That's around 18%. 263 or 80% produce syrup to sell. 26 purchase syrup to then process and sell onward, which is about 8%. And then 51 said they would purchase sap, whether to process themselves or to sell on. That was 15%. And one thing that came up earlier, we were talking about what percentage are farm operations versus pure maple enterprises. And anecdotally, it was kind of a bit of everything, but I will say it was, in terms of who I was speaking with and who was calling me and asking, this was largely folks with anywhere between, a relatively small operation up through folks with hundreds of thousands of taps. But it was largely operations who were already producing maple or are already a farm operation who are looking to expand into maple. We did have a few of those diversification projects as well. I just looked at it during this meeting, and over 86% of the syrup producers, so the 263 applications who said we produce syrup to sell, report over 1,000 taps. So a significant majority are 1,000 taps or more, but that did range anywhere from 335,000 taps to 55 taps. So there were just a handful of those smaller backyard operations, but it really ran the gamut. And then those are sort of the really high level items. I have some really interesting data that might be more of a long down the road conversation regarding the what operations reported in terms of their sap collection and syrup production between 2022 and 2023, because as we know, 2023 was pretty much a wash if you were in agriculture at all. And we across the board saw a reduction, whether it was in collecting sap, making syrup, purchasing sap. It was pretty much at least a 10% reduction across the board, across all of our applicants. So I found that to be kind of an interesting interesting point of reference. But I'd love to, if there's more specific data that you're interested in or would like us to dive in on, I'm happy to take a look at it.
Hey, thanks, Madison. Representative O'Brien.
I just wondered how you're gonna award these grants.
That's a great question.
Yeah, we've had a few meetings about it so far. So we had every single eligible application was reviewed by 3 reviewers. And they scored it on a system that was weighted toward different categories. So we asked them, how did this application address the funding priorities? How well did this application show that they had the technical expertise required to successfully pull this off? We asked about budget, et cetera. And so we do have those scores, and we also asked for a holistic score. So sort of a gut check on a scale of 1, no, I would never fund this application, and 5, if we have the money, we should definitely fund this application. How would you see this project? And that's going to be a really illuminating thing to hold next to the more nuanced multi-part score out of 100. And then we also collected commentary from the reviewers. So we had them describe strengths of the project, weaknesses of the project, and then some overall thoughts if they had any more. So with all of that in mind, we're going to be leaning a lot on those reviewers. That's why we had 3 do each one, so that there was a good spread across the scores in terms of expertise and just scoring focus. Some folks tend to score lower than others, just by the nature of who they are. And so our goal is to try and separate out sort of a top percentage. We don't have that percentage specifically solidified yet, but we'll take a top percentage and then really take an internal team and look over those more carefully and identify what an award slate looks like. We'd like to diversify across the state, obviously, as well as operation size, and hopefully hit all of those funding priorities as well. I will say I took a really cursory glance at the if we just sorted it by the topmost scores out of 100, we could fund 11 grants. And of those 11 grants, we've hit, 9 counties, 2 produce sap to sell, 9 produce syrup, 2 buy syrup to process, and 1 indicated that they would purchase sap if they needed to. And so it's even just based on the scores alone, without further digging into the process, we have a pretty good spread. So I'm hoping that will shake out a nice slate of results. But we're still kind of in the weeds on that process right now.
And I'll just add that our reviewers are both internal to the Agency of Ag and external partners across the state as well.
We even had some folks from the Cornell Maple program and University of Maine Maple experts as well come on in for the first time, which was a lot of fun.
Especially when we realized we had more than 300 applications and we didn't want any of our reviewers to have to review 50 applications each.
Yeah,
and each applicant reviewer can't have a conflict of interest with any of the applications. So then that's like a conflict of interest step in the process of sharing the list of applicants with everyone that volunteered to be a reviewer to make sure they felt confident that they could objectively review. So yeah, it meant that we had to have a big swath of individuals that have big maple expertise, maple connections, but are not applicants and don't have a conflict of interest with any applicant.
When you said earlier that you had 16 reviewers, I thought
63.
63 reviewers, whatever number it was, I thought I misheard it, so I obviously did mishear it. Are they being compensated for their time?
They're not.
So the folks from Maine, for example, in New York are just, you have a relationship with them and can reach out and.
Yeah. Well, I will share that I think for this particular opportunity, I feel that most of the reviewers are probably doing their regular jobs while they're reviewing, so they are being compensated. For some of our programs, we do have compensation for reviewers who are not getting basically paid as part of their regular work to do reviews, but I'll let Madison finish her point.
That's basically what I was going to say. A lot of these, like the University of Maine, that was their maple expert there. Same with the same with the Cornell maple program. So largely, this was sort of part of their job, and it was an opportunity for some of them to explore this data firsthand and explore these requests firsthand, which is a connection they don't necessarily always get with producers. The same would be true for some of our state partners, like we had folks from the Vermont Land Trust, Intervale, those sorts of organizations where this falls a little bit under their job description and they have reviewed for us in the past.
I will just say, I think this is a policy choice,
Yeah.
though, for government to really look at in the future around
Yeah.
how we compensate people that are not part of an organization that would pay them to do this work. We do rely upon their expertise. It takes significant amount of time to review applications, and we don't have a really clear and easy mechanism by which we can compensate people that are not on a board or, part of some sort of like established commission to provide them a per diem.
I'm trying to
for grant review.
think back to, all the way back to last spring, whenever it was, and the couple of different programs that we were talking about here in this committee. Did we set aside some funding from this program, some amount of funding to help pay for the administration of it?
Yes.
Did.
We did, okay.
Did,
But
yeah.
none of that went to the,
It did not.
okay. But Representative Levitt.
Well, I was just going to ask, of the 11 applications that you feel like might make it through, what's the average award amount?
That's a good question. So for those that very cursory, this is not necessarily the 11 that will make it through. The average falls around 54,000 for like the ask, and the median was I think 45. It covers the whole gamut from $15 to $100,000. It really does the whole thing, and so too does our kind of general bell curve of requests as well.
Thank you.
Representative Lipsky and then Representative Rice.
Yeah, Abby or any of you, I'm really interested if your evaluators from Maine or Cornell, meaning Maine and New York State, do they have a similar funding Maple grant program? Or are they benefiting in a way by seeing how Vermont is valuing the industry?
It's a great question, Representative Lipsky, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know unless they.
Like being leaders. I think people would like being responsive to something that's a real profit center or success story in agriculture.
Yeah.
And we're excited to be behind it. I'm just curious how limited it is.
Well, it's interesting. We met last week with Vermont funders from within U.S. Department of Agriculture, within the lending community, to see if we can kind of garner some additional support of organizations that may want to fund some maple applications that are really high scoring and high quality, that are focused on climate resiliency, food, safety, and production efficiency. And, some of the comments made were, well, aren't you lucky to be able to have a granting program that's not a loan and that's particularly focused in the maple industry? We don't see that very often. So I can't answer your question specifically to know if Maine and New York have similar programs, but the general sense was this is a bit of a gift and a privilege to be able to make an investment in a single sector like this. And again, something similar within the meat sector and produce industry, next month. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know, Madison, if that conversation ever came up with your colleagues.
I don't have that kind of information, though I will say, for example, speaking with Mark Iselhart at the the Proctor Research Center at UVM, he acknowledged that this is a pretty rare opportunity for producers. And I think that was kind of across the board from the other stakeholders I spoke with. So while I don't have specific data on that, I do think this was a fairly unique opportunity.
I would,
Yeah. You got it.
I just want to say one thing about match. So while we had no match requirement, many applicants did actually include match in their application to explain the value of their own labor, the value of other, whether it was in-kind goods and services or actually cash or loans that they were going to put towards their project. So in some cases, a request for $100,000 might represent a contribution to a project that's actually going to cost them $250,000. But even for many of the smaller projects, like say a $20,000 project, they explain that they're actually putting, either cash or something valued at, $5,000 to $10,000 into the project. So I just wanted to specify that.
I was just wondering if out of the funding priorities, if anything sort of rose to the top as the place that the Vermont maple industry seems to be most excited about and most in need of.
Yeah, so obviously folks were able to choose more than one funding priority, so it's not a clear split, like they didn't have to decide just one. But 96% chose operational efficiency, among others, and then 62% chose climate resilience and 58% chose food safety. So operational efficiency really came out on top there.
Madison or anybody else, can you give a couple of examples of what a project funded at the $15,000 level might look like, and then at the other end of the scale?
So the kind of fun thing about maple is that they can actually look very similar. They just have, it's just a increase in the size of the boiler, for example. At $15,000, that tends to be one piece of equipment, not necessarily always, but it might be an RO machine and the installation to get that going. It might be an upgrade to their sugar house to, increase their boiling capacity. It might even be a small storage area. That's one thing we saw quite a bit of that I was surprised by. Just being able to store, even just a small outbuilding to store your produced syrup, or a single sap storage, refrigerated sap storage. Whereas once you get up into the higher amounts, it can be very similar, but on a much larger scale. That might also include some more infrastructural approaches. So one thing we encouraged applicants to consider was, say, roads, or improving transportation across their operation in order to improve efficiency, or even to improve to address climate resilience. This came shortly after the floods, and we were seeing a lot of washed out roads, and there was some impact to sugaring operations through that. So the answer is that it's a lot of the same stuff, but just on a it's how big you expand the scope.
I was thinking about maybe as another way to respond to your question, Chair Durfee, is many of the applications spoke about innovative technologies that they can install within the sugaring operation. One that sort of I was not as aware of was putting flow monitors on your main lines so you can identify leaks within different sections of the woods. So that's both a production efficiency or operational efficiency, but also a labor reduction, to Christina's point of attending those basketball games. So rather than, a lot of time is spent walking in the woods looking for leaks, so that you're getting as good a vacuum pressure as you can into your, for your sap supply. And knowing which section of the woods, or your multiple woods, if you're in the 100,000 tap category, knowing where to go first to fix the greatest number of leaks is a real efficiency perspective that can be added to your business. And so I don't remember the details, but it's like you need one of these flow meters per, 1,000 taps or something. And so, one operation had 3 already in their sugar bush, and they wanted to add 21 more. And they were expecting that would be both a labor saving, a labor reduction, like a labor improvement, just like better quality of life for their team that worked so many hours during the very short window of, tapping through to the last boil. And so, I loved reading those stories and sort of like hearing how this is both good for the business, but also good for the team, which is often family members or neighbors or friends that sort of work for them.
this might not be something you have the answer to as a direct result of this grant process, but it just occurred to me that I don't know, like, of the maple businesses.
Yeah.
You know, above the hobby level, obviously, in Vermont, what is, like, generally speaking, what percentage have made the transition to RO?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Another good question. Yeah, I think for the maple experts, I don't know. I mean, there were many reverse osmosis application requests. Some were like purchasing them for the first time. Some were purchasing larger systems. Some were using more efficient systems, or requesting for more efficient systems. But yeah, we were sort of laughing that if all of these projects were to happen, like our maple industry manufacturers would be in really
Yeah.
good business for the next 2 years. Because there's a lot of equipment and, you know, like a modernization of operations that.
Well, maybe
that businesses
Canada
wanna do.
should fund our grant program in the future.
Yeah. But I would love to know the answer to that question also. And I don't know if the Sugar Makers Association has an anecdotal sense of that or even of their membership.
So you've got the panel of reviewers
Yeah.
scoring the applications.
They're all scored. Everything's been scored. All the score comments are in.
So now it's trying to make the difficult decisions. And when do you expect to announce those decisions?
I think the vision is to do the review, the final selection process within the next week. And then I don't know if we'll have follow-up conversations that we need to have with any of those prospective grant applicants before we start the grant, grant agreement process. So it'll probably be announced within, I don't know, we said within January is what we kind of posted and shared with the industry. And I think that we feel like we're still on target for that timeline. So I would say sometime in the next few weeks.
Great. Not soon enough to have an impact on this year's process soon. Given that some people already are boiling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was that these awards would go through, gosh, now I'm forgetting the timeline. Is it through December of 2025?
Yes.
So 2 years that they have to spend the money and do the project. But yeah, I think few actual decisions will be made by these sugar operations, but for this season, but more for preparation for next season.
Are there, it's a question about the other components of this tree.
I was gonna, yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if you have similar outreach sort of strategies planned for the produce and meat and what that will look like.
Definitely. So we are close to publishing the request for applications for meat and produce now. I know that we are also sort of simultaneously, it's not part of the outreach officially, but we are hosting a series of listening sessions around the state, both in person and virtual, where we'll be sharing that opportunity with folks. We'll be sharing it via AgriView, our monthly newspaper, both online and in paper, through our digital channels. And we haven't actually talked about maybe doing a postcard. It's a little, we don't quite have all of the addresses that we would like to have for, targeting meat and produce. We probably have some, but we could also consider either doing, we've done postcards in the past, but we also can do, because we do mail AgriView for free to every farm for which we have an address in the state, we can do sort of like inserts in AgriView that really highlight, like, this is an opportunity we really want you to know about.
When you send a postcard like you did for people, is that coming from the admin budget that was set aside for the grant, or is that sort of separate outreach funding?
That's a great question and something we thought about a lot. The mailing did come out of our AgDev General Fund, and we were able to pay for the postcard with Specialty Crop Block Grant Program funds, where we had a little bit extra. Those are USDA funds, but that's not always going, like that won't work for meat, for example. And that's just due to Madison also overseeing the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program and us being able to identify, like, yeah, we've got $1,500 here that we can use to print this postcard.
But the admin money that's been withheld to not be competitively granted is mostly for project management and administration of the grants. So Madison's time and a colleague, Sarah McElvaney, who's running the produce and meat program.
I just wondered besides the three priorities, if there were questions about sort of the sales and marketing side, like whether people that I want to do something value added, or I want to start, something similar to Morse or Bragg. Were there questions on that, or does it seem like there's sort of satisfaction with the price sugar makers are getting for this commodity?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to the price side, but I will say that that was one sort of eligible project type that we excluded from this opportunity, in large part because it seemed like a better fit for a working lands business enhancement grant. So if folks did have a marketing specific project, they could apply to working lands for that. But even, I'm trying to think off the top of my head about the maple projects in working lands, I don't think anywhere specific to marketing. Madison, do you have any other insight there?
Yeah, so I will say, just based on my anecdotal conversations, dozens of conversations with dozens of maple farmers, I will say that no, they're not satisfied with the price they are getting for that commodity, particularly in light of rising costs for everything else, but the cost of maple has not gone up. But that was, again, just anecdotal. And yeah, and again, marketing and sort of business enhancement business development were not really covered under the grant. It was primarily focused on infrastructure and equipment, et cetera. But we do have some data on how they sell their syrup. So whether it was in value added products versus wholesale versus retail, which might be of interest to you, and that's something that I can pull.
And related to that, through the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, we do often support the Sugar Makers Association in marketing projects that will benefit the whole industry. And so we also thought that, specialty crop tends to be a really good fit for those broader projects and also projects focused on marketing.
But there were definitely applications where value-added production was what they were applying for. Not every application was just to produce more syrup or produce more sap, but they really were looking at how do we market it climate smart, or how do we, value add this into additional products. So again, I think that's part of the criteria that we'll be thinking about when we're looking at making final decisions, is hopefully finding high quality, high scoring applications that also has a variety of what they intend to do with their application or with the project.
It strikes me as maybe one of the reasons you had so much subscription to it was that what we're sort of not used to here is this is an industry that's ascendant. And you're offering grants as opposed to things like dairy, which is always like, if we don't get money, we're going to go out of business. So completely different sort of situation from us.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to ask some of these same questions of the Sugar Makers Association on behalf of the industry, to know if they would agree that the industry is ascending. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's certainly a growing market for maple products. I think it's an increasingly difficult industry to be viable in. I think, we're seeing, labor challenges, energy costs, production efficiency challenges. Some of the applicants were like, we have a sugar house that doesn't have potable water, and we've been hauling water, and that's not really a very efficient model for, a growing business. And so I think there are, and then you take into consideration climate shifts and the seasonal variability. I would guess that the industry overall would say that, yes, they're feeling productive, but also feeling challenged in many, many ways. And that, these infrastructure investments and other kind of market supports are really valuable.
So, yeah, really just for the committee's education, we scheduled the Sugar Makers Association to come in on Friday and answer some of these questions and maybe other questions that we'll come up with between now and then. And I'm wondering whether, before we wrap up our legislative session at the end of the year, will you have any information you can come back and share with us about this next round of
Yeah,
applications?
so those
Definitely.
decisions should be made in April
Yep.
for produce and meat.
Great.
And yeah, and maple at the end of this month. So yeah, I think we'll have both.
All right, we're running
Yeah.
almost over, but one more question. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
It's just going back to last session, I remember Secretary Tebbets pointed out the trajectory of the Vermont brand and the marketing, and he singled out Run Amok, who has globally, all over Asia, Europe, all over the Americas, has been marketing maple product in some of the tiniest vessels imaginable, and has experienced a real explosion of exposure globally to the no limits to what attention can be brought to Vermont maple products. So maybe they're bigger, well-funded, fancy marketing backgrounds, but it was what spirited a lot of his excitement or your agency's excitement that this is a really critical potential that shouldn't be ignored.
And there I think are many of those sort of successful stories of the Vermont brand being well marketed. As we all know, and as the case across any sector, it's really about the quality of the product. And so I think that the fact that 263 or whatever the number that Madison said of these applications are also focused on food safety and product quality is also encouraging and reassuring that it's not just put sparkles in something and it sells, but you actually have to provide a high quality product for it to really do well. And, and that's part of what our industries really thrive on here in Vermont, I think. Yep.
Madison, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Madison.
Of course, thanks so much for having me.
And
Thank you very much.
thank you. Yep.
Yeah, happy to come back and share where this all ends up in a couple weeks or a few months, whichever works best. Yeah, you will. We can't wait either.
We'll take a break, committee, and can we say quarter of? Thank you. Yeah, I did.
Yes.
Yeah,